green trade policy. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist with Deutsche Welle based in Brussels and Berlin. I mostly cover EU politics, but also environment and energy policy. So we're going to be talking today about a subject which I think has come up in many, many panels during this Congress, and that is trade and globalization. How should the Greens respond to the political developments of the past year? And those developments have been, I don't need to tell you, very significant. The recent success of anti-globalization populist parties, most notably here in the UK with Brexit, also in the US with Donald Trump, and the possible future successes of anti-globalization populist parties in continental Europe, have put the Greens in a somewhat awkward position. The Greens have been warning about the dangers of unrestricted free trade run amok for many years. And now all of a sudden these far-right parties, the populist parties, are grabbing onto the message, running with it, and getting some significant electoral success. Now the Greens, as we saw this month, are also having some electoral success. But it's put the Greens, I think, in somewhat of an uncomfortable situation of suddenly sharing a message with some of these far-right parties, these populist parties. So I think what we're going to talk about here today is what differentiates Green policy on trade issues. Are the Greens, quote-unquote, protectionist? Are they anti-free trade? And if not, if it's something more nuanced than that, what is it that the Greens want to focus on in free trade? I know certainly, since I mostly cover the European Parliament, it was a bittersweet moment, I think, for the Greens in Brussels who were gearing up for the fight on TTIP, which is the EU-US free trade policy. And then all of a sudden TTIP disappeared, at least for the moment. And that wasn't from Green pressure, that was because of the election of Donald Trump. So was this something to celebrate? Should Greens think about working with Trump and some of the other populist forces who share a lot of the skepticism about unrestricted globalization and free trade? Or should Greens participate in the cordons sanitaires with the mainstream parties against these new political forces? So that's what we're going to talk about here today. We have a very distinguished panel to tackle this very thorny issue. So I will introduce who we have here today. So all the way on the right, we have Gieke Tano, who is from the Third World Network from Ghana. Then to his left, we have Reinhard Bütikofer. He is an MEP from Germany, of course, with the German Greens. To Reinhard's left, we have Wiko Hasegawa from the Green Party of Japan, co-president. Then next to her left, we have Richard Di Natale from the Austrian Greens. He is a senator and leader. Australian. I just spent a month there too. You'd think I would have that right, but no. Australian Greens, and he is the leader also. He's a senator and leader of the Australian Greens. Then to his left, we have Elizabeth May. She is an MP in Canada and also leader of the Canadian Green Party. And finally, we have Caroline Lucas, who I'm sure you all know. She is co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales and also an MP. So thank you all very much for joining us. Reinhard, I want to start with you, with a question for you, because so much of the development in this area that we've seen over the past year has been moving quickly, I think, in the European Parliament. And you as a parliamentarian will be well aware that there's a significant portion of society that feels like they are being left behind by globalization, that they've been left behind and that they don't see the benefits translating down to them. But you'll also be aware that sometimes recognizing this fact puts Green MEPs in the same camp as some of the populist forces like France's Front National, for instance. How do the Greens, what is the difference between the Green MEP's position on free trade and that of Front National or some of the other populist forces?
Well, look, if UKIP and us agree that yesterday it was raining and today the sun shines, that doesn't put us in the same camp. And similarly, I would say the fact that there is substance to the accusation that globalization is leaving people behind does not put me in the same camp as those who want to make use of those criticisms to pursue nationalist or chauvinist or protectionist policies. I think that maybe some of us were not fully aware of how much it could get worse when we were fighting over TTIP, for instance. But looking at what Trump advocates is certainly neither attractive nor fair, nor would it at all solve any of the contradictions that are inherent in the present process of globalization. On the other hand, it would enhance those contradictions, because what he basically says is the least minimum bit of multilateralism that we might have also in the field of the trade law has to be abolished. He says we will not honor WTO obligations that we have accepted in the past. He says, I want to negotiate deals in which we can leverage American superiority to force others to do our bidding. So obviously, we're not in that camp. I don't believe there's just two camps, and some of the people that we put on defense in our criticism of TTIP and other trade deals, the so-called free traders, I come back to that phrase, the so-called free traders have tried to fight back by saying, look, you criticized us, now Trump comes up with his protectionism, you are in his camp, aren't you? I think there's three camps really, not just two. One camp is the protectionist camp that's never been a progressive cause. Another camp is the free trade camp of those who believe that trade is even more free if it is completely unregulated. And that's the camp of the big corporations. Traditionally, if you look back in progressive history, free trade has always been a progressive cause until it got hijacked by corporations and the arcane science of international trade lawyers that used the phrase to pursue an end that is not in accordance with our concerns as citizens or consumers or workers. And this kind of free trade was subservient to, well, to put it simply, the big corporate interests. And in between those extremes, there is a camp where we should stake our claim, which is the camp that says, yes, we want free exchange because closing of borders and closing of the mind is part of the same negative process, but we want to have free and fair trade. And being fair implies having rules that do not benefit big corporations at the expense of SME, that do not benefit the business world at the expense of the workers or the producers at the expense of the consumers. That's what we've been fighting over, and what we can claim as a big success, I would say, over the last 2 years in Europe, is the fact that for the first time ever, trade became a public concern. Before that, it was, as I said, an arcane science. And people said, well, somebody will take care of it. And this hasn't changed by coincidence. The fact that new free trade agreements are not about tariffs anymore, not that much about tariffs. They're much more about regulation. And that, of course, gets to a sensitive point where we have fought for sensible environmental protection, sensible consumer protection, data protection, workers' rights, labor protections, and all of a sudden, through the back door, through regulatory cooperation, these protections are in danger of being undermined through trade, which is intrusive into our daily lives. And that's what changed the picture and what brought the public onto the scene as an actor, and this is changing the trajectory of public trade discussion, and for the better, I would say.
I should mention, by the way, this panel is being organized by the Green Group in the European Parliament, and if you have any questions, you can ask them via Twitter. I'll call on people as well, but if you're feeling shy, you can tweet at the Green Group in the European Parliament's TTIP hashtag, which is TTIP Beware, at TTIP Beware. And I'll read off some interesting tweets at the end if they are interesting enough. Let's turn next now to Richard. So we got the European perspective there and what's been going on in Brussels. And what about in Australia? You recently gave an interesting speech to Australia's press club where you outlined your concerns, specifically about this idea of who's being left behind by globalization and by neoliberal ideology generally. What has been Australia's experience with globalization, and how do you think Australia has done, or could do better, in managing this transition while protecting people at the same time?
Well, firstly, let me echo, I think, many of Reinhardt's comments. I mean, we share a similar view in terms of the role that trade has played, the potential benefits, but also the trade as it's practiced right now in terms of benefiting corporates ahead of ordinary members of the community. And we've been free trade evangelists for decades. We have been a nation that has really trumpeted the role of free trade, being an island continent located where we are. Successive governments have seen trade as a pathway to prosperity, and unfortunately the sort of trade that's been practiced in Australia is one that has benefited the interests of large corporations ahead of ordinary people. A recent analysis done by our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, just at a purely pragmatic level, showed that trade deals are always overpromise and underdeliver. So what we've seen in Australia, for example, is that we have a number of bilateral trade deals with the US, with Japan, with China, Korea, a number of other nations, and each of those collectively has made a very, very modest contribution to our economy, and some modelling done to 2035 shows a 0.05% increase in GDP in 20 years' time, resulting in a few thousand more jobs and less than $1 billion in increased GDP. So it's the trade deals have always overpromised and underdelivered. Our experience with many of those trade deals has been, in fact, that they are there to deliver corporate profits, to water down environmental standards, public health standards, labour standards, animal welfare standards, and so on. One of the most recent experiences we had was when we introduced our plain packaging legislation. So Australia introduced some of the world's first plain packaging laws around cigarettes. On the same day that we introduced those laws, Philip Morris, an American-based company, used a trade deal that we have with Hong Kong to rearrange its affairs and to launch an investor-state dispute under the investor-state dispute provisions to launch an action against the Australian government because of that deal undermining their profits. They lost subsequently, but it really did in Australia raise awareness of, well, who the hell are we doing these trade deals for? What is the purpose? And given that every time a new trade deal struck and we're promised rivers of gold, they haven't delivered. Instead, what we've seen in Australia, and it's a similar pattern to what we've seen right around the world, is this growing gap between the rich and poor. Australia, which has prided itself on its egalitarian traditions, is now seeing a bigger gap between the super wealthy and average Australians, bigger than at any time in our history. And trade is being seen as a contributor to that. One of the reasons that we've seen the rise in our version of Donald Trump, Pauline Hanson, a far-right politician, has been because of people's concerns around trade. So what we are experiencing in Australia is it's not unique. It's a theme that we're seeing right around the world, but it does, I think, reinforce this idea that international trade is something that hasn't delivered for people. The people have been left behind, and they're looking for solutions. And those people who have been critiquing international trade, like the Greens and like some of those people on the far right, have been the beneficiary of that sentiment.
Let's move on to another part of the world, Africa. So, Tano, as we've heard how Europeans are viewing what's happening, what Australians are viewing, from Africa's perspective, how do you think African countries are viewing the success of Donald Trump on the back of this anti-globalization rhetoric, in this kind of rethinking of globalization and of free trade? In Africa, is it viewed as a problem, an opportunity, or maybe a little of both?
Well, I think for most people in Africa and most people in the world, Donald Trump is no solution to the problems that have been associated with globalization. He's a supporter of the transnational companies. He's not against neoliberalism, even if some of what he says implies that. But we also have to say straight away that the people for whom Donald Trump has created the most immediate political crisis, which is the mainstream establishment, are neither a solution themselves. Because they are those who've enacted most of these free trade agreements. They're those who've promoted coal-fired power stations all over Africa as a solution to energy deficiency. They're those who promoted energy, oil and gas and other fossil companies to take over natural resources in Africa. The list goes on and on and on. So to the degree that what we're seeing in terms of the emergence of Trump and what you're describing as a populist and so on, is the crisis of this center ground, this extreme center which has embraced neoliberalism, scramble of resources, war, and so on and so forth. To that extent, I think it's understandable that we can say in unison that globalization as we know it is not working. That's not a secret. But we can also say that since nothing has yet replaced it, the old can't seem to continue the way it did. The new is yet to emerge. All kinds of, strange phenomena will emerge in the interim. And Trump would be one of those. And I think that from that point of view, to say then that there is a problem if there is a polarization away from what the center has held as the mainstream, I don't think most Africans would agree with that. Trump represents a polarization to the left, to the right, sorry. And we certainly need for something different from what has been, and therefore Greens and others who are fighting for trade justice and so on should seek to promote a polarization to the left. Which is to say, just like Reinhard and others have said, reining in the transnational companies through all manner of means. They still control a good 80% or so of world trade, okay, ensuring that they're obligated to apply standards in terms of, labor costs, universal incomes, labor costs, environmental regulations, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's important to see that to the degree that Trump represents some degree of a problem, it forces everybody to rethink. Here he is talking in terms of economic nationalism, which actually should have a different name, naked imperialism. He's saying that United States corporate interests, there should be no barrier, no regulation, no control, no accountability, and that Americans should have the leeway to use their corporate power more nakedly around the globe. Okay? So that is not an antidote to what we see today. It's not nationalism to the degree that the United States is a global power. It is a more naked and imperialism, and there will be those who will be relieved by the degree that the notion that there is some element of honesty, and that now we really know what we're up against, and that is not a matter of, and this is what neoliberalism actually looks like. We're seeing its true character in that different way. But insofar as your question goes as to whether it's a problem or an opportunity, I think that willy-nilly all of us have to rethink quite radically what the co-leaders of the Green Party here in Britain said in the earlier speech. I think it's important to reiterate the point that we all have to think very boldly and quite radically, and that if that includes jettisoning many of the things that Donald Trump seems to be destabilizing. WTO agreements, free trade agreements, part of what the EU represents, certainly in cases like in Africa through the economic partnership agreements, and absolutely, so must we. And in its place, not promote transnational companies, but promote livelihoods, sustainable livelihoods, jobs, incomes, and the harmonization between human beings and nature that is necessary for that sustainability. I think that this is in that sense, it could be an opportunity. It won't be an opportunity if we are not as bold as the co-leaders of the Green Party implied we ought to be. And therefore, worrying about labels, whether protectionism is the right label or not, to me is a slightly academic point. If it's a matter of protecting people's jobs and enhancing it, so be it. It's a matter of protecting the environment against rapacious plunder of natural resources, absolutely, and so on. So it's an important opportunity. The center cannot hold all well and good. The center wasn't doing that well for the majority of people anyway. And I think those of us in this room and all the audiences that we're in networks that we're connected to, this is the time to step forward and put forward real alternatives. Otherwise, it will be the Trumps and the Western Trumps that will follow.
Rico, what about in Japan? Japan has obviously an interesting history in terms of trade with the outside world, also an island nation like Australia. What can the rest of the world learn from Japan's experience with trade?
Yes, the lesson from Japan's history of flowing. In the age of Japan's rapid economic growth in the 1960s, the world had free trade system based on GATT regime. But the world economic system and Japan's policy was different from today. What was the difference? Firstly, the yen currency was undervalued because U.S. government at the time was obsessed by strong dollar ideology. Secondly, the Japanese government was not obsessed by free market ideology and neoliberal free market ideology. So I'd like to explain the lesson from Japanese history for developing country. It was a rapid economic growth accompanied with the devastation of labor conditions and environment. Japan is known with tough labor conditions together with suicide or karoshi and with environmental pollution, Minamata, Itai, Fukushima, and so on. There are not the past history, many victims remain uncompensated. We are in favor of human development and of elimination of poverty, but developing global citizens do not have exactly to follow the Japanese way. Then what is required? Firstly, fair trade. Developed countries should support development by importation. It is as important as economic aid. Of course, the protection of environment and labor conditions is prerequisite. Secondly, transfer of technology and knowledge. That is, knowledge of pollution control and environmental policy. We are in favor of exchange of manpower.
Thanks very much. I want to turn next to Elizabeth with the Canadian story. It's interesting because I think Canada, if you think about it, has been in kind of the center of a lot of trade issues over the past couple of years, most notably here in Europe with CETA, which is the recently agreed free trade agreement between the EU and Canada. And one of the most sensitive things about CETA, which I'm sure a lot of people in this room feel strongly about, is investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms. So obviously this has been something that is very important to the Greens as an issue. It's probably a little in the weeds for the populist far right to be focusing on very tightly. But why do you think, why has Canada been such a focus for these investor lawsuits, investor state lawsuits?
Because we were stupid enough to sign on to the very first one in Chapter 11 of NAFTA. And actually, the negotiators for NAFTA, and I've spoken with them, did not understand that it was the language they put into NAFTA in relation to expropriation of corporate assets would be open to interpretation for something other than the common sense meaning of someone has come to your country and built something, and your government has now nationalized it, so you will owe them money. The NAFTA language was quite an accident, or at least an accident for the impact that it's had, in that we were the first country to have such an agreement, and the language was that if something that an investor, which has been loosely interpreted to mean any foreign corporation, whether they've actually built anything in Canada or not, all you have to be is a foreign corporation with an interest in making a profit in Canada. That is the translation of investor. And you will find yourself as a government owing that foreign corporation money if you've done anything to interfere with their expectation of profits, or as in the language of Chapter 11 of NAFTA, any governmental action, quote, tantamount to expropriation. So we quite accidentally found ourselves the poster child for losing cases more than any of the cases that have been brought against us. They're on environmental grounds. So the first one, or health. The first was in 1997, was when Ethel Corporation of Richmond, Virginia, the company that gave us leaded gasoline, I mean us, the world, and it had now developed another gasoline additive called MMT, which was also a neurotoxin. Our government banned it. A vote in our parliament banned it. And that was the first time that a foreign corporation saw the opportunity. Actually, they didn't see it. A very sneaky lawyer from Toronto named Barry Appleton saw it. I call these guys global ambulance chasers. They see an opportunity to bring a suit against a government that has entered into an investor-state agreement, and they will bring it. So we ended up repealing our law, paying out $13 million to Ethel Corporation and giving them an apology. Cases since then have included suits from PCB Destruction Incinerating Company when we banned the export of PCB-contaminated waste. One person's PCB-contaminated waste is another person's profit. We've lost case after case. The most recent atrocity of a case is one where a US-based quarry company that wants to get quarry material for highways in New Jersey sued in a secret tribunal over an open environmental assessment hearing, which ruled that this project was so damaging to the environment, threatened the survival of the most endangered whale on the planet, was impossible to imagine a mitigation strategy, and urged the project be turned down. Bill Kahn of New Jersey, with an option to go to Canadian domestic courts, decided not to. Went to the secret Chapter 11 tribunal and got a ruling that the tribunal had been unfair to them. The investor-state provisions, as Richard has mentioned from the Philip Morris case in Australia, highlight the central feature of why Greens oppose the current round of trade agreements. They're not about trade. They're about taking away from domestic governments and democratically elected parliaments the business of what parliaments should do and expropriating that to corporate rule. So they're about taking away the power from domestic governments and giving it to foreign corporations. And that's how you can judge, is this a real trade deal or is this about corporate rule? And if it's about corporate rule, by our very essence as Greens supporting grassroots democracy and basic decision-making to the people, of course we'll oppose agreements like this. And please, European Greens, it's not too late to stop CETA. You don't want to have an investor-state agreement embedded in a trade deal with the EU.
I mean, to follow up on that, I mean, the investor-state dispute issue is a huge one. I hear it from friends who are not necessarily involved in politics when they talk about CETA especially, but also TTIP. They're very, very concerned about it, but it makes them innately opposed to any free trade deal. So is the Greens' position, I mean, does it risk not being nuanced enough to allow for some form of free trade without this type of thing, to focus on, that is the problem, not free trade itself?
Well, you have to question why anyone would want any new trade deals in the world. When you look at the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, it kind of covered everything. And it led an exception in Article 20 that if you're protecting natural resources or human health, there's an exemption. You can't bring that forward in a trade deal. When we just had the GATT, it was still okay, for instance, in the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer, to use trade sanctions as an enforcement mechanism within a multilateral environment agreement. By the time we got to Kyoto, only 10 years later, no trade sanctions were allowed. Why? Because we'd gone beyond treaties that allowed the trade in goods. Through the Uruguay round and the creation of the WTO, we'd created a separate form of global governance, able to say to all the trade ministers on all the same cabinets with the environment ministers, when you go to Kyoto to protect climate, you're not allowed to use trade sanctions because the WTO won't like it. And there's no regulation against it. So it was a very profound shift towards corporate rules. So again, why would we, right now, when you look at what's in CETA, and you look at what's in what would have been TPP, which we, and when we go into the renegotiation, if we do renegotiate with the Trump administration on NAFTA, what you see governments in these days wanting is what global corporate rule wants. Trade in goods, I mean, if we really have belts and suspenders at the same time, they could get rid of NAFTA, there's still the free trade agreement. They got rid of the free trade agreement, there's still the GATT. Nobody's going to be able in the current climate of the interlocking and interdependent economies that we have, no one's going to be able to say, my country is putting up a, forgive me for the Trump thing, putting up a wall, and nobody can sell any goods here that we're not going to slap with a tariff. The U.S. administration, and I mean, Donald Trump is constantly surprised. It must be interesting being him. He didn't know about the U.S. Constitution, and now he's discovering there's global trade rules, and the U.S. does like to do business in other countries, and they're going to find them. Okay, things are complicated. So finally, he's going to discover that he can't actually bring up trade sanctions without countervailing sanctions that are endorsed by the WTO, and that the U.S. can't actually cut its ties around the world. But it can keep handing over things to corporate rules. So that's how I think that's the dividing line. And I can't speak for all Greens, but we want those things for our domestic economies that create good jobs in a way that sustains the biosphere. If a trade deal does that, we can be all for it. But if it's all about destroying the planet faster in the interest of short-term profits for a handful of corporations, we tend to be against it.
Caroline, I want to turn to you next, and I want to ask you, Caroline, about how these trade issues boil down into campaigning. Obviously, the big issue here in the UK right now is the triggering of Article 50, which begins the Brexit process, which took place 2 days ago. So the Brexit referendum was one, there were a lot of factors involved, but I think certainly a resistance to globalization was a big part of what motivated people to vote to leave the European Union. Interestingly, now we have Theresa May kind of claiming that Brexit is a champion of global trade. I don't know how that works, but from what you learned during the referendum campaign, what do you think for the countries that are having elections coming up, and for the Greens who are involved in different electoral issues coming up, what can be learned from the Brexit referendum in terms of recognizing and tapping into a public distrust or unease with globalization?
Well, I think what can be learned is that we need to get some much better campaign lines on our side of the debate. What we discovered was that having facts and evidence and details was entirely irrelevant, that what you needed was some kind of emotive slogan that you would have thought would not have had the cut through that it did, but simply that phrase about taking back control was so clever and so powerful, and it spoke to people who felt in so many areas of their lives that they didn't have control. Now, of course, the irony was that that was very little to do with the EU and very much to do with successive governments who have failed to invest in housing, in good jobs, in education, in our NHS, in our health service. But all of that was wrapped up and became the EU bogeyman, even though the EU, as I say, was very little affected. And I think one of the things you see right now is that those same Brexit leaders who were saying the importance of the referendum was taking back control now when we're talking about future trade deals or indeed our future relations with the EU, are not at all interested in giving people back control. They don't want scrutiny, and they don't want MPs, the people's representatives, to see what's going on. Taking back control actually meant giving control to the government, and that is very convenient for the government. And I think as far as trade is concerned, what worries us now is that our government wants to demonstrate the success of Brexit. So they want to be able to negotiate some free trade agreements as fast as possible. And in spite of the fact that the EU 27 have said, hang on a minute, you can't start negotiating third-party trade agreements until you've sorted out, you know, the divorce with the EU and whatever other agreement might take its place. In spite of that, we are hearing that there are secret talks going on with all kinds of countries about future trade agreements. We know more than anything that Theresa May would love to have a trade agreement with the US. And that is very frightening because we imagine that she is not going to be terribly concerned about social and environmental standards or indeed about investor-state dispute mechanisms when she's negotiating that trade agreement. She just wants to demonstrate that outside the EU, Britain can be a buccaneering, wonderful, independent state that can sign all these independent trade agreements. And so our very real fear is that battles that we thought we had fought and won are going to have to be refought. And those are the battles around things like the import of products containing beef hormones, or the things like scrapping the precautionary principle and importing GMOs, things like chicken chlorinated, you know, soaked in chlorinated water. All of these things that until now we've had 27 other member states who have been very helpful in standing up for key principles like the precautionary principle. The real fear is that that is just going to be thrown over. And just in the last few days, you might have heard of this thing called the Great Repeal Bill, which is a very odd title. They're not really repealing it. They're just simply, they think they're cutting and pasting a whole set of European legislation and putting it into UK domestic legislation. And they try to say that that will make it safe. But they also, when you press them, acknowledge that, first of all, some environmental legislation will be very difficult to move across because chemicals legislation, for example, has a whole architecture of the chemicals agency and keeping the legislation up to date. But also key principles like the precautionary principle or the polluter pays principle are not going to be brought across. They underpin EU law, but they don't sit there in a way that can just simply be cut and pasted and moved across. So I think the very real worry as we go forward is that we're going to have to fight these battles again about trying to protect key social and environmental rights at a time when actually the capacity and the expertise in the UK is not as up to date as it should be, because until now it's been the EU negotiating with CETA or with TTIP and so forth. And so many of the EU NGOs, many of the EU experts have been there in Brussels fighting those fights, not necessarily in London or in Edinburgh or in Cardiff. So what we need to do, I think, is to build up our capacity, make really good links with the EU 27 to beg Greens from those other countries, and indeed all the countries in the world, if you find the UK knocking on your door wanting some kind of agreement, please can you make sure your governments are trying to put social and environmental standards into those negotiations, because we're pretty sure ours won't.
And if you look at the speed, if you look at the speed with which these free trade agreements would have to be worked out theoretically before an EU departure, I mean, it's probably not going to be very sound free trade agreements. But then I would ask, in the coming 2 years, if we have to accept that Brexit will be a reality, which I don't necessarily think is the case, but let's, for hypothetically say it is a done deal and it can't be avoided, is the Greens' mission now to block all of these rapid free trade agreements that might be struck between May and Trump and UK, Australia, UK, New Zealand? Is that going to be the Greens' main focus in the coming years?
I mean, realistically, I think blocking them is going to be very difficult. I mean, sadly, in the UK at least, we're not exactly. I try to be busy, but we've got one seat, and there aren't many votes that go, one in favour and 649 against. Well, anyway, so it'll be tough to block them. But what I hope we can do is mobilise the public to realise that there is a real threat. And the thing is, I don't think the general public have any idea about the threats that we face through the Brexit process, because it's not been in any of the discussion and the debates. You know, the Greens have tried to raise environment and social standards in the debates about Article 50, and no one was listening. But I think once now we have more of the environmental NGOs working with us as well on this and being much louder, then I think when people do recognize that this could mean GM products coming to a supermarket near them, there will be a real concern, because there's no great desire to have those kinds of products on our shelves. There's no desire to roll back workers' rights. And I think when people do realize that that could be at stake, then certainly we'll be making common cause with them and common cause with our colleagues across in the rest of the EU and elsewhere to try to stop that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to point to, that there is a great necessity to really coordinate between the battles that you're going to be fighting and the battles that we're going to be fighting. I also see on the part of the EU some urge to hasten some additional trade agreements. I mean, there is talk, a lot of talk in Brussels these days that somehow the EU should view the abandonment of TPP as an opportunity for itself to strike additional trade deals. And a lot of people from DG Trade in the Commission are pushing very hard to hasten the process, which would expose us possibly to similar dangers like the ones you just explained. And in addition to that, there is one deal still underway that it's not been getting enough attention. It's one of these alphabet soup deals called TISA, the Trade on Services Agreement, Trade in Services Agreement, which is a very dangerous attempt by a group of nations to set a global standard for trade-based services liberalization that would undercut public service in all the countries concerned and beyond, because it would serve as a global standard. So I think there's really a need also over the next 2 years to really combine the efforts.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, and no, I did want to add that, yes, there are those on the Brexit side, for example, who right through the campaign maintained that without, I mean, away from the EU, Britain would have a freer hand to pursue a more aggressive trade policy with many countries. About 2-3 weeks ago, there was a conference in London, a Commonwealth Trade Conference. You've had characters like an MP called Doddridge. I think he was a minister in the Foreign Office. He's now the chair of the House of Commons Committee on Africa or Trade or something like that, who believe that this is a time to leverage, Britain's direct bilateral power, especially since, the imbalance is greater with many of these former Commonwealth countries, okay, to actually, go the way Trump also wants to go and so on. But we also have to understand that, so that Trump is not an aberration, for, entirely. Just as I said in the beginning, he is also an expression of part of the dysfunctionality and the deformities of neoliberal capitalism. Okay, but in any case, we also have to appreciate the fact that the free trade agreements, in as much as they are important frameworks, do not tell the whole story, because they themselves are predicated on existing practices and projections on the basis of those practices. So UK or Britain or whoever might fail to get an agreement, say, with India or South Africa or Nigeria. It doesn't prevent individual UK companies or companies clustered in one sector, oil, gas, telecommunications, whatever it is, to gain extreme liberal measures, upon which then there might be an attempt to systematize it and so on. The EU, Britain have long been norm setters in international trade, and very often, certainly from the point of view of working people all over the world, in a fairly pernicious way. And the last element I want to point out that, the trade issue is not that arcane, because most working people, including workers in Britain, know directly what is meant by this enhancement of corporate power. They know it in terms of their jobs, they know it in terms of cutbacks in public expenditure for the things that they need and rely on and so on. So the ability to connect the groundswell of dissatisfaction with neoliberalism expressed in the Brexit vote. People sound very confident about the EU 27. I don't live here, but I don't share that confidence, okay? But I think something from the ground up ought to be the kind of alternative that we look to. And that's something from the ground up is able to marry interests that people express the conditions and the aspirations that people want, need, are thwarted from attaining, and that on that basis, more international solidarity, as well as a greater knowledge, because you have a vested interest in what is happening globally, is also important. But there are many jackals who would like to take advantage of what is happening now, to move breakneck speed and, and take advantage of the chaos and the imbalances and uncertainties. And I think that we ought to be on the lookout for them, but more critically, we ought to be on the lookout for where we can begin to build the kinds of solidarities that resist these same measures, whether they're at home, abroad, or wherever else they may be.
Well, let's try to flesh that out. I just want to see if, as a group, we can formulate this. This may be related to what you're about to say, but how we can really define what a green trade policy is. I note that a common answer, both on the left and right now, when politicians or activists or whoever are asked, are you anti-free trade? The most common answer is, I'm not against free trade, I'm for fair trade. But what does that actually look like? Because we know that's very much a talking point for populist parties on the right, and I also hear it from Greens and from people on the left. What is the essence, if you had to just stop somebody on the street and explain to them what the essence of a fair trade policy is, how would you explain it for anyone? Richard?
So I'm going to go back to your earlier question about what would you do with these rapid-fire free trade agreements. To start to answer that, our experience with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement was we didn't know what the hell was in it. So the first point has to be that it's an open, democratic, transparent process so that legislators and indeed the community know what they're getting into. That should be point number one. So, at the moment...
Just to push back on that, the answer to that is always, well, we need to have the ability to negotiate. We can't give away our hand because then we'll get a bad trade agreement. How would you counter that?
My answer to that is, if you don't want to tell the people what's in it, well, don't bother coming to us as legislators and asking us to support it. It's pretty straightforward. So, the TPP was 6,000 pages, and we were asked to, as legislators in the Australian Senate, we were being told, you need to tell us whether you're going to support this or not without ever having seen it. That's what, first and foremost is being presented to those of us as legislators as free trade. Well, that's not free trade. That is profoundly undemocratic. And while we talk a lot about budget deficits, one of the biggest problems we've got in liberal democracies around the world is a democratic deficit, where we're seeing people being separated from the democracies that are supposed to represent them. We're seeing huge corporate interest through campaign finance, donations, etc., dominate political agendas, and they're doing it through trade agreements as well. And we just heard from Elizabeth about the role of ISDS provisions, which are effectively there to do the bidding of big corporations. At their heart, what they say is, we are removing the power from you as democratically elected legislators to make decisions. We are going to locate that decision within a tribunal, handpicked, who make a decision somewhere in secret on the validity of a claim of a corporation. That is not a democracy, right? That's a plutocracy. So you want to know what a green free trade policy looks like. First and foremost, open, transparent, democratic decision-making, and a process for resolving disputes that's also open and democratic. That's principle number one. The second, I think, principle has to be we're negotiating up in terms of protections, not down. Environmental protections, labour protections, public health protections, animal welfare protections. Trade, trade's a bit like technology. It's neutral. Trade can be a force for good, it can be, a force for disruption and negativity. So if we're going to embark on trade agreements, let's make sure that as a principle, we're negotiating up on all of those key standards. If we can achieve those things, if we can achieve an open and democratic process, and one that achieves an improvement in all of those standards, and one that delivers for people and not for corporations, then of course it's something we'll entertain. But until we have that framework in place, then you're going to continue to see the opposition to these trade agreements that you're seeing at the moment.
Thanks. I completely. I think one of the first things to say, which will always surprise the public, is to say a free trade agreement should be about trade and goods. Well, people think that's what they're all about, but they're not. They're about trade and services. They're about deregulating. They're about changing the location of power and control from a democratically elected government to a private tribunal that operates as if it was a private dispute between contracting parties in a business context. That's the context in which a foreign corporation brings an investor-state dispute against a government. It's fundamentally corrosive to democracy to imagine that a foreign corporation has superior powers to a domestic corporation to complain of a government action that was not taken with any animus to interrupt trade. So if we look at this and say, look, where does this populist outrage come from? What's the authentic, honest place for that anger? And there is a place for that anger. It comes from a neoliberal agenda that included deregulation as a central tenet, liberalization of trade as a central tenet, that, as you say, promised and underdelivered. It promised, boy, I can tell you, Canadians, when NAFTA came along, thought we were going to have a really wonderful open border. We could cross into the U.S., we could do all kinds. So watch what's happened with trade liberalization. Goods can flow, services can be privatized, taken away from local control, but people can't move much at all. So things are pretty, it's pretty perverse. And I think when you say, look, a trade deal shouldn't it be about, you shouldn't be able to stop a smaller country with a small economy from being able to sell their products fairly into our economy. People would say, that sounds fair. But if you tell them we should be able to say that our Canadian mining company has a right to sue some smaller African country if they pass a law that says that the rapacious activities of Canadian mining companies violating human rights should be stopped. Those are not trade agreements. Those are corporate rule agreements.
So a fair trade agreement is one that's limited to goods. Yeah. Reinhard?
I would add 2 points. One is a green trade agreement, I would think, should also contribute to fostering the transition, the green transition of our economies. A guiding principle could be the Sustainable Development Goals. So we could measure trade agreements against how would they contribute to sustainable development. For instance, when the TTIP negotiations started, we were trying to advocate that they should be used possibly to reduce fossil subsidies on either side of the negotiation. Of course, there was no chance of getting that adopted as a part of the agenda. But that could be a meaningful element in a trade agreement that we pursue. So that would be another criterion for me. Another point I would like to add is about...
Just to follow up on that, isn't that kind of the opposite of what Elizabeth is saying, though? Because if you're saying that this should be limited, if we're adding in extra goals that, goals that deliver a higher humanitarian good or environmental good, then are we not getting into the territory of making them too complicated again?
Well, I don't think it's an option to run away from the necessity to reduce fossil subsidies. I stick with that example. And as long as we try to do that unilaterally, we're always being opposed by industry saying, well, but our competitors on the other side. And it's very hard to get together a majority to overcome such opposition. But if you act plurilaterally or bilaterally and say, okay, we go step by step and we do it on either side, both sides would win. And I think that has been done in the past in the context of reducing agricultural subsidies in the international trade sphere. So why couldn't we do it with CO2 subsidies? I don't think it's easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that's one of the challenges that we have. And there's another challenge that I think we should also address, which is protecting against unfair trading practices. For instance, in England, over the last 3 years, a couple of thousand jobs in the steel sector have been lost because of unfair dumping imports into the UK from China, against which we had no good defense. I think that's also part because it helps protecting jobs that would be undercut not by any fair trade, but by unfair practices. And the third element that I would add is multilateralism as a rule. All of us have spoken against Trump's approach, this bilateralist approach. I think if we try to formulate what would be the basic idea of global governance, it's multilateralism. Everybody obeying by the same rules that have been agreed by everybody. And I think that is also a very important principle with regard to trade.
Just to clarify, I didn't mean to say that trade shouldn't be complicated, but what we've done is the modern suite of trade agreements have imposed on governments such things as thou shalt operate under U.S. intellectual property rules. That's an intrusive and invasive decision that was made through negotiations in the interest of corporate rule. It has nothing to do with trade and goods. Trade and goods can quite properly say, as Reinhard said, you can't subsidize something that's so damaging to the biosphere that in another context, multilaterally, we've all agreed to phase out fossil fuels. So our trade rules should be consistent with the applications of multilateralism. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in again.
Caroline?
I do agree with most of what's been said so far, but because there's so much agreement between us, I think it's time to be a bit controversial. So, at the very beginning, Reinhard, I think you said, protectionism has never been a progressive force. And I agree with you until now, protectionism has had a very bad name, because basically in the 1930s it was about protecting your own economy and then aggressively exploiting the economies of others. But also actually just now, Reinhard talked a lot about protecting jobs and maybe protecting standards and so forth. And so I want to make a case for reclaiming a bit of protection. But what I mean by that is Reinhard was just talking also about the economic dumping when it comes to the steel sector. But I think we should also be mindful of social and environmental dumping as well. And so if we want countries to be able to go ahead with higher environmental standards, higher animal welfare standards, then it seems to me to be fair to think about some way of being able to protect, for example, farmers in the UK who are meeting higher animal welfare standards than their competitors. I think we should think of a way of protecting them from unfair competition from people who do not maintain those same standards. Otherwise, essentially, if we want to have higher standards here in the UK, then we are handing our farmers a knife to cut their own throat if we're also asking them to be in competition with other importers who are not maintaining those standards. Now, how do we do that? I think there's certainly a case when those imports are coming from poorer countries which perhaps don't have the resources to invest in higher standards in their factories, let's say. Well, then let's look at whether or not we could levy a tax at the border, a tariff at the border, we called it, border tax adjustment, but use that money to go back to the country in question, to the exporting country, to invest in their kind of higher standards in terms of being able to enable them to compete on a more equal level. And just finally, I want to say that I think amongst all of the principles we talk about, we should also include a proximity principle, because international trade is responsible for huge amounts of CO2 emissions. International trade often includes the simultaneous exchange of exactly the same products between exactly the same countries. So cookies go from Britain to the US and biscuits come back from the US to the UK. And as Herman Daly so beautifully said, wouldn't it just be so much better to exchange recipes? And I think we could learn a lot from that.
So, I mean, if I hear what you're saying, should green politicians and activists not be afraid of using the P word? Should they start to reclaim protectionists? Should they be not afraid to say, I'm a protectionist?
Well, because it has such a bad connotations, I'm not necessarily saying use that word, but certainly if we're serious about relocalizing our local economies, if we're talking about giving power back to local communities, then in some senses, I think that has to enable some degree of protecting higher social and environmental standards from those who would try to use competitive pressure to lower them.
I would shun the P word because it doesn't fit with the overall philosophy of the Greens, which is open to the world and open in our minds. And I believe that notwithstanding this, we have to provide protections. So I'm not questioning the need to protect. I gave this one example, and I agree with your examples also. But the overarching philosophy has to be one of exchange and one of free exchange, and not one of closing our borders and closing our minds.
But not more trade.
No, not, of course not. But with regard to the issue of proximity, my solution would be different. I wouldn't put that into a trade rule. I would put that in the price of carbon. And I would price carbon efficiently, and then a lot of the problems would disappear economically. So the same goal, different. Okay, good.
I want to turn to you just, we can use your interpreter back here. But, so from a Japanese perspective, what do you see, as a green Japanese perspective, what do you think is a fair global trade policy?
Allow me answer in Japanese. So, 私が考えているにですね、一つは、歴史的に先進国は皆保護主義を取ってきました。
I think what I'm thinking about is one reason is in history, the advanced country taking the initiative.
非常に現在の中国並みの保護主義をとって今現在の先進国それは成長を遂げてきました。
Protectionism that support the growth of the trading.
ですので、私たちは、途上国に対しては保護主義を取るべきではないと考えています。
So we don't think we have to take protectionism to 当局というのは中国ですか？
途上国、発展途上国です。
To the developing country.
しかしですね、私はもちろん保護主義には反対です。ドナルド・トランプの保護主義には日本は反対しています。
Of course, I'm against the protectionism, especially in terms of Trump's protectionism.
貿易というのは広く開かれたものであるべきです。
Trading has to be open, wide.
私たち日本の緑の党は、いくつかの、政策を、この貿易に対して、提案したいと思っています。
We want to propose some policy from our Japanese Green Party.
第一にフェアな貿易です。
First, fair trade.
先進国は途上国の製品を受け入れ開発を手助けする。
We have to help the development in terms of importing the product from developing countries.
これはいかなる経済援助にも、勝ると考えています。
This is superior than any economic aid.
ただし生産国の環境と労働条件の保護、そのための規制を普及させることが前提条件です。
Of course, the protection of environment and labor condition is prerequisite.
そして、国際的な炭素税や、輸送燃料税によって気候変動と過剰な商品流通を抑える、これが必要です。
And secondary, transfer of technology, knowledge, and that is also knowledge of pollution control and environmental policy is very important.
第2に国際資本移動のリスクの制御とグローバルな、分配公平性の実現です。
Secondary, controlling the risk of international capital flow.
国際金融取引税、すなわちトービン税を実現することが重要だと考えています。
And also to realize the international financial tax and Tobin tax is important.
Thanks a lot. We have a question from Twitter, actually, and I think this is in response to something that you said before, Elizabeth. The question is it better to, and it doesn't have to be you who answers this. In fact, it might be a better question for Tano, actually. The question is, should Greens support the WTO instead of bilateral talks? I'm not sure if this is possibly relating specifically to Brexit, because I think that's an interesting question for the Brexit talks. But in general, I mean, you mentioned that maybe we're just doubling up too much on these trade talks and a global trading framework could work better. Maybe Tenno, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. The WTO is one example of the problems that can come with multilateralism as well. Because obviously, if you give formal equality to people who are in fact unequal, you are actually replicating that inequality. So for multilateralism to work, then I think that there ought to be trade agreements, back to your question about protectionism, which then might mean that countries that are more vulnerable ought to have rights to protect themselves against, some of the different
countries that need more protection.
Exactly. So what then matters, I think, is not so much the words, but the substance. And through that substance and through its practices, the same old word may have developed new meanings, or new vocabulary may, emerge to describe the better realities that we aspire to or we are beginning to attain, and so on. But I think that a progressive or green trade policy ought to explicitly aim for that kind of redressing inequality. That could include, for example, ensuring that there are no free trade agreements between advanced northern countries and developing southern countries. It could include, for example, that in the WTO or whichever international trade forum might replace it, there ought to be meaningful, special, and differential treatment for and adequate policy space for the developing countries, and so on and so forth. It could also mean, for example, that in the areas where developing countries are particularly vulnerable, for example, in the commodities regime, there ought to be measures that allow those countries to stabilize. There's a lot of volatility in international commodities. Someone mentioned mining. Okay, whole economies are tanking in the last 18 months or so simply because of the crash in commodity prices. If there are trade agreements which allow those countries and the direct producers in those countries to stabilize their incomes, to diversify their economies, to develop appropriate green and sustainable technologies, those then would be the meaningful trade initiatives. But it ought to take place in a context where people do not think that it is someone else but not us, that we are subsidizing someone else. And that's why the necessity of combining domestic justice, economic justice, with global solidarity is all important. It has to be that way. And you can do so in ways in which people see the reality of the different ideas that are being put forward in terms of their relevance and their meaningfulness, but also see the necessity and the gains to be made from actual solidarities with people. But it comes from challenging power. And the WTO is actually the bastion of the already powerful. And don't be surprised if one day Donald Trump turns around and finds the WTO as a convenient instrument for some of his programs as well. The key issue is neoliberalism and global capitalism. Let's call it what it is. And whichever way we can restrict its debilitations, whichever way we can advance alternatives, whichever forum we can do that, let's do that by all means. But most of all, let's rely on the power of the movements and the unions and so on and so forth. And, popular people, the farmers who are suffering the worst, bearing the worst brunt of these trade, to generate the alternatives through which then you have more sustainable alternative trade regimes and alternative trade policies.
Reinhard, I saw you shaking your head. Do you disagree?
I disagree very fundamentally. On one hand, preferential treatment is not a revolutionary invention. It's happened, and I know I could cite a couple of examples where the European Parliament, for instance, has voted in favor. For instance, on raw materials trade issues, we have said as a parliament, that doesn't necessarily imply that the governments follow that course, but we have said we want that. We want to acknowledge that, as you say, poor countries can defend their markets in order to be able to not be exploited by the structures that we all know. So that's not a new thought, and I subscribe to that. But to say that, number one, any trade relation between an OECD country and a developing country is exploitative by nature, well, then you say it again.
No, I said free trade agreements, which are a particular thing with particular understandings. You've all described them, including what you said about TISA and non-trade goods, trade in intellectual property, trade rules, and all those are free trade. Those are the meanings of free trade agreements. So if I say there ought to be no free trade agreement between Britain and Ghana, Absolutely right. I insist on that. And I think that I hope that you'll come around to supporting that view. Free trade agreement is an important specification.
You just say you don't care for the words. You look at the substance. Yeah. Here I would claim
the substance of free trade agreements is what I'm talking about.
If you say the free trade agreement is unacceptable, I would withhold judgment until I've seen the provisions that are in the agreement. Yeah. But the other thing that I wanted to object to was that you said WTO, that's just another phase to the neoliberal world. I think we should not be going too easy on analysis. Give me an answer why, if this is all the same neoliberal catastrophe, why Trump and other nationalists want to fight multilateral structures. Why? If this is just the same, why? I believe that WTO has a lot of problems, and we might, if we had the time to discuss that, even agree on most of the points. But it has one basic advantage, which is that it creates a multilateral framework. And it does not do away with the differences between the countries. You're right there. But civic rights don't do away with the differences between individuals either, and it's still better to have a democracy than an autocracy or plutocracy. So just denouncing the principle of equality of international partners because it's not the ideal world and paradise on earth is just a bit unrealistic, sorry to say.
Do you want to come back? Can I respond?
Elizabeth's been champing at the bit.
Well, just because I certainly didn't want anyone on Twitter misunderstanding that I suggested for one moment that Greens should associate themselves with the World Trade Organization. And my view is much closer to Tano's on this. I've seen what had been in the 40s and 50s a quite well-intentioned effort to not hurt the economies of smaller nations through industrialized world protectionism. The opening up of borders was seen in those days. I mean, let's face it, whatever you want to call it, the right wing of any generation is very good at appropriating the language that sounds nice. So liberal sounded nice. Protection sounded nice, and then you get neoliberalism and protectionism. So in the course of the Uruguay round, and I'm sorry to go back to this, but in the course of the Uruguay round, it was 8 years of negotiations that started in the late 1980s and led us into midway point of the 1990s and the creation of the World Trade Organization. And for the first time, we had these trade deals that weren't about real trade. They were about changing the notion of power and taking power from democratically elected governments, and I hate to repeat myself, giving it to corporations. In whose interest? All the intellectual property rights provisions in the World Trade Organization, all the provisions around trade and services are in the interest of the world's largest transnationals. So I agree with Reinhardt. As Greens, we will always stand for multilateralism. But there's a very clear distinction to be drawn between our view of internationalism and the globalization that has robbed so many people of their livelihood, has exploited the planet. So in dividing between those of us who believe in internationalism and multilateralism and the Trump worldview, why is he against it? He is against anything that isn't about the U.S. having a sort of imaginary dominance of the world that he remembers from some comic book sometime that he once read. And I also think Trump is an anomaly within all of this. Trump is the only person in business that, as a billionaire, he's only dealt in one kind of business, and that's real property that doesn't move around. Don't think he has any real concept of trade, whether neoliberal or green or anything. He's grasped something that helped him win an election. I don't think he has an ideology or a practical approach, but he has put in place all around him the crony capitalists of globalization who will have no interest in taking power away from transnationals and returning it to the people. And that's where Greens can step up and say, we have a better prescription for the ailments of a world that sees that some people are getting super rich while the planet and everyone else is suffering.
I want to take another... Another question from Twitter. It's a reaction to this idea of making protectionism not a dirty word again. So somebody asked on Twitter, what specifically, if we're talking about protecting local economies, what sort of protections are we talking about in concrete terms? So if you were talking to somebody worried about their local economy, their local community, what can you promise them you would protect in a green-inspired free trade deal? To anyone?
I will, but... sorry, I'm just thinking about the best way of answering the question. Because I think, for me, what I'm interested in first and foremost is the protecting of those higher standards. So if you are a community that depends on farming, let's say, and if, as I gave the example earlier, there is a big push in the country for higher animal welfare standards, and yet you are being asked as a community to allow in imports from a place that doesn't have those same standards for farmers, then I think it would be right to say that you do not want to accept imports of products that don't meet certain animal welfare standards. You can take that idea a step further, which would be that you know, you could look particularly if actually what you were talking about was less an individual community and more nationwide, higher CO2 ambitions in terms of reducing our impacts on climate change, then if there are products coming in from countries that have produced those products in very carbon intensive ways, and in your country you're trying to persuade your factories and your industry to adopt higher environmental standards, then one way you could do that would be to put a so-called border tax adjustment, a tariff at the border, which would have to be arranged at a national level, obviously not just in a local community level, but the government could put a tariff on certain products that were very carbon intensive in their production process to say that you should not be undercutting us environmentally, you should not be environmental dumping. But if that is coming from a poorer country where they are struggling to meet those higher technological standards, that is where I think there could be a mechanism where the revenue from that border tax adjustment goes back to the producers in those countries where they invest in making those standards higher. Because this is not about trying to say we want to protect because we don't like poorer countries having a piece of our prosperity, but it is about saying how do we do this in as fair a way as possible, but also enable our companies to go further. Because certainly in trade negotiations, what I have seen, and I used to sit on the International Trade Committee in the European Parliament, is that one of the strongest arguments businesses use to persuade their governments not to negotiate higher standards is because they fear unfair competition from those countries that don't have higher standards, and that is always the argument they use. So if we can somehow find a way to neutralize that argument, to stop them using that argument, and to demonstrate that is not going to be a risk, then I think we've got a better chance of being able to make more ambitious deals.
I mean, leading off on that, so a couple of you have brought up, you know, environmental issues. How do we make trade policy more environmentally friendly? And you talked about issues like carbon credits or issues like, you know, not sourcing in unsustainably produced things. Is there not, for the Greens, which got started as an environmental movement, is there not some kind of innate contradiction between trade and environmentalism in that very often trade across long distances is more environmentally damaging than locally sourced products? If you have a free trade regime in which it is more cost effective to import your apples from China rather than importing your apples from the farm next door, and is there not an element of free trade in which that's inevitable, actually, and then is there a contradiction there?
Can I just very quickly jump in, and I'm sure others will, but I just think currently we have an economic system that externalizes environmental costs. And Reinhard said earlier, very rightly, that what Greens want to do is to internalize those environmental costs so the products that you buy tell the ecological truth. And so in that respect, if we had a proper tax on the CO2 emissions from fuel, if aviation, for example, did not managed to get away with not paying VAT on its fuel, which it does still by some crazy anomaly, if you internalize those costs in the final product that had come from the other side of the world, then I think, as Reinhard said, you would find a system where, in fact, your products from down the road would be a lot cheaper than the ones coming from many miles away. Right now, quite often, it can be the opposite.
Carolyn just, I think, said what I was going to say, is that ultimately we're not paying for the true environmental and social costs of the goods that we're consuming. And it goes to that point about, you know, is there a contradiction between the notion of the Greens wanting fair trade, let's call it fair trade, versus the notion of localism and wanting to consume locally and so on. And what that really reflects is that people don't have faith in the goods that they're consuming from somewhere else, because they know that the environmental standards, the animal welfare standards and so on are simply not high enough. And so it's much easier if you can go to your producer up the road, or somebody you know who you've got a relationship with, who you know is not using chemicals in a completely unregulated way, who's ensuring that if it's animal agriculture, that animal welfare standards are kept high and so on. And so people that move to localism does reflect the failure that we're seeing in our economic system to give people any degree of certainty that what they're consuming, whether it be from overseas or from a distance, is being grown and produced in a way where those labour standards, animal welfare standards, environmental standards, public health standards are being maintained. And so, no, I don't see a contradiction at all. In fact, I see it as absolutely consistent that if somebody's wanting to make ethical decisions about their consumption patterns, that if they don't have confidence in the system that produces those goods, that they would choose to source those goods locally. And I think the challenge is on us is really to ensure that we can create a system that gives people that confidence and that actually harnesses the power of trade as a potential force to improve the lives of people all around the world, because we know it has that potential not being realised at the moment.
Let me... Well, Tenno, yeah, did you want to talk?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I'm slightly handicapped in that I'm not a member of a Green Party. I don't think there's a Green Party in my country anyway, so I'm not purporting to say what a green policy ought to be, but definitely as part of the environmental, ecological justice movement, I think that the views that we can all share and learn from each other. But I think that the juxtaposition between trade, international trade, I know you keep slipping into free trade, I wonder why, but trade need not be free trade in terms of what we understand it to be now. Trade and localism is not necessarily, it may be a false juxtaposition, in the sense that if we take seriously what everybody here has said, that we are all free and equal citizens of the globe, then the best things that are produced elsewhere, best in all the senses, best of the word that we can think of, ought to be available to everybody else. If there's a good textbook or a good computer that's been produced, it ought to be available to those who are not yet in a position to do that for themselves, and it mightn't always be wise that they ought to replicate that process all over again anyway. What is important, though, is the relationship between people, human beings. That is the critical thing. It's not a matter of goods. The conditions under which the goods are produced is a relationship between human beings. The conditions under which they're exchanged is also a relationship between human beings. If that requires that a big multinational company can dump goods in a certain country, which destroys the productive employment of all the local people there, their resources that they have control and access to, the accountability that comes with everybody being in a cooperative environment such as that, then that is a problem. Okay, localism in itself is not an abstract, a solution, because the local can include a plutocrat. It can include a wife beater. It can include a homophobe or a racist or whatever it is. So local and community and do not in themselves address the problem about the kind of equitable human relationships that enhances everybody's capacity to live well, to contribute, to share, and so on. And from that point of view, that is why I say that from that point of view, it is not always the case that we ought to stop at the question of international trade. Because international trade is also made up of building blocks from elsewhere, multinational companies, so on and so forth. Likewise, alternatives to what exists in the particular variant of international trade can include a heterogeneity of different models, including local models, including cooperatives, including worker-owned firms, including farms of all kinds, and so on and so forth. What is important is that people are allowed to produce in harmony with one another. People are allowed to control much of what they produce. People are allowed on that basis to exchange what they want, on the basis of the fact that those things are being produced according to those principles, according to the fairness of the distribution of gains, according to the harmonization with environmental concerns and so on. And it's not such a far-fetched notion. And that's why I think people are attracted to localism, because they can see a lot more tangibly what the possibilities are. But it is precisely because we have the means of actually internationalizing much in the world today that allows this local model, also this localist model, or this idea of the ideas of justice and cooperation that are immanent in those localist models. We can also conceive of those beyond the local and have ways in which we are beneficiaries of the finest things that the entirety of human civilization can provide, as well as the initiative, the drive, the energy, the passion, the sense of ownership and belonging and contributions that people at whatever local level can make. And that requires a far more radical thing than simply saying that multilateralism, without making the necessary qualifications, is necessarily the answer. It is also a lot more complicated than simply saying localism is also, in and of itself, is immediately the answer. I think we are capable of coming up with a bit more nuance than that.
We've got some great questions coming in here on Twitter. So again, if you want to send in your questions via Twitter, tweet them at TTIP Beware. So here's an interesting question. Can trade deals be a force for good? Maybe I'll just ask a show of hands. Do trade deals have the capacity to be a force for good, or are they a necessary evil?
Which trade?
Trade deal, any trade deal. Can a trade deal help people and do more good than harm?
Sure.
Does everyone agree with that as a precept? Tano?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Trade is suit for my shirt. That sounds
Okay. Yes, so I want to, let's see, we've got some, I think it's 6:15 actually. So we have got, okay, good. So Caroline has to head out. We've got until 6:15. I'm going to take another couple of these Twitter questions. This, I think, is, Elizabeth, a question possibly for you.
Okay.
What are the panelists' opinions on a multilateral investment court? Does that solve the problem?
No, it doesn't. That's the short answer I could take. The notion of an investment court, for those of you who don't follow this stuff closely, it's only in CETA. There's the notion, Cecilia Malmström, the EU trade negotiator commissioner, came up with this idea, well, if these secretive, horrible tribunals of arbitrators like Chapter 11 of NAFTA, oh, and by the way, the stupidest agreement Canada has ever entered into, which I should probably say is the stupidest agreement any nation on earth has ever entered into, except for the People's Republic of China, which won this one, is we have an investor-state agreement with the People's Republic of China with no trade benefits, no liberalization of access to markets, just a straight-up secret tribunal, so any state-owned enterprise of the People's Republic of China can bring secret charges against Canada anytime, and we're bound to it till the year 2045. So, but back to the question. In the face of these secretive trade agreements, secretive investor-state disputes, in an effort to get CETA through an unwilling European Union, this notion of an investor court came up, as though this would solve the problem, because it would be more like a real court and less like what it's been, a secretive group of arbitrators meeting in a hotel room somewhere and taking away democratically arrived decisions. The problems and their flaws, I mean, it's clearly better, relatively speaking, that taking away our rights not be done in secret. But the investment court, as proposed in CETA, does not give citizens rights of access to present themselves as litigators in the sense of a court. It doesn't create an opportunity for those who worked to get a toxic chemical banned to bring in the leading scientist to explain why the toxic chemical had to be banned. It doesn't create a structure where the arbitrators are actually like judges and blocked from representing in other tribunals, like they're allowed, within the EU, they're only allowed to be judges in arbitration procedures, and not within the EU represent as an advocate on one side or the other. But nothing precludes these folks from being what I called earlier, the global ambulance chasers. A kind of criminal class of $1,000 an hour lawyers is the fastest way to explain this setup. So they can go do that other kind of work and still sit as arbitrators in the investment court. It does not solve the problem.
Reinhardt?
On CETA and the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism and the ICJ that is proposed under CETA, I completely agree with Elizabeth. That's not an option. Hypothetically, I would say that an international, globally operating, multilaterally based investment court that allows not only companies to sue, but also allows us to sue companies might be, hypothetically, might be an interesting idea. But I don't see that as a very pragmatic and realistic solution, so I'm afraid we might be wasting valuable energy in the pursuit of such an idea that may sound good on paper, but is not anywhere close to realization. So maybe we should focus on other points.
Caroline makes her apologies, by the way. She had to run out, as you imagine. She's very busy today. What does this kind of multilateral framework look like from the Greens' perspective? If this multilateral framework is the kind of the best way to get around some of these issues, then how do the Greens think such a multilateral framework should be designed?
That's tough because we have no ideal architecture that we can relate to. Some of the shortcomings at WTO have been described a couple of times. It's still, at the moment, the closest thing to what we would aim for, but it's far removed from where we would have to go. So I don't believe that Greens would be very smart if they came up with an architectural competition over how to shape a possible multilateral framework. And I believe our function is a completely different one. Our function is to help voicing the criticism that citizens have with present trade regimes and the criticism that countries have against overbearing trade regimes that we are pushing onto them. I mean, we're not just the victims of trade, we are the perpetrators of trade to some degree, and have been for a while. So I think our function is a critical function and a function that opposes the real threat, and I think Elizabeth has put that well, the real threat of creating a world of international economic relations where the ultimate sovereignty does not lie with multilateral institutions, does not lie with nation states, does not lie with local communities, but with the corporations. That's the dystopian vision that some people pursue, and to oppose that, that's what we have to do.
The worst case scenario. Okay.
Yeah, can I just say, I agree. I just think that the more we talk about trade in isolation from the underlying inequalities, the perverse and quite exploitative relationships that have arisen. You trade in a vacuum can't really be examined without looking at structural adjustment, without looking at the requirements placed on debtor nations in the developing world, and these now are sometime in the past, but they have had their effect of telling a nation, you don't look like a worthy debtor because you're growing food for your local people, and you'll do much better with a cash economy if you could grow flowers for Europe. You'll look much better to us at the World Bank or the IMF if you're growing something that you can export for cash. So there's been decades now of post-colonialism. So we've lost the empires of the crown, and we have the empires of the almighty dollar and the Cargills and the Monsantos and the Coca-Colas, and they've redesigned the world in a way that advantages their shareholders. So when we now talk about trade, we don't start tabula rasa. If we're starting with where Richard is, which I completely agree, fair trade is about free and open and democratic and transparent, and that has to start with non-coercive. So if the place in which nations around the world find themselves has already been coerced to the place where they are not enabled to make their priority in domestic politics self-sufficiency in food security, then you can hardly say any deal for trade is fair.
So in our remaining time, I want to take our 2 questions from the floor. You've all been waiting patiently. Thank you for that. Let's start with number 1 here.
Thank you, moderator. I would like to get the panel's view whether the European Union, as a free trade deal, is a good laboratory or model for more global, wider deal. And just to say that with the criteria that the panelists had mentioned, it is multilateral, it has a democratic chamber, it has an open court where interested parties can try to get standing, and it has possibilities of internalizing taxation rather than a border tax, as Caroline had mentioned. I mean, these seem to fit the criteria that the panelists had mentioned. So I would like to get...
So should the EU be a model? And I want to take the second one now as well, number 2.
Thank you. You raised the issue of can these agreements be negotiated in public? And the point is that the same rules actually are being negotiated in public, for example, at the World Intellectual Property Organization, where they negotiate patents and so on. And as civil society, we can sit in the room where the negotiators are, we get the text, we can speak. The same rules like e-commerce are being negotiated at the World Trade Organization, where the negotiating texts are regularly released. So we can see, for example, at the WTO, that the EU, Japan and the US are proposing things in e-commerce that are worse than the TPP, worse than CETA, and worse than TISA, which would allow your private data to go to anywhere in the world with no privacy safeguards, where it could be sold to advertisers and insurance companies and so on. But we only know that because they released the negotiating texts. It's the same proposals as they are making in the free trade agreements like RCEP and TISA and so on. So my question to the panel is, where the Greens are in power at the subnational level, for example, local governments or provincial governments, do they have the power to influence your trade negotiators at the national level or the EU level? And the reason I ask this is because, for example, in CETA, the local government's ability to regulate services is much more restricted than national or provincial because they don't get the Annex 1 exceptions. So local governments cannot change their laws, and they must be as simple as possible, unless they are the few sectors listed for Annex 2, which does not include things like pipelines, transport and energy. Thanks.
That's an interesting question. Okay, so let's take the first one first.
Grab it first.
Yeah, the second one.
The reason, and I love to know what you think when I say this, those who are in the EU, but we, through Canada's involvement in NAFTA, which was a one-way ratchet down on environmental standards and health standards and labor standards, and for years now I've been saying, but look at what they did with the European Union. If every trade agreement is a voluntary agreement to loss of sovereignty, in a democracy, you could do what they did in the EU and create a European Parliament, so that the loss of sovereignty in one nation has a supranational new creation of a parliamentary democracy in a European Parliament, and where the poorer countries within the EU were told when in joining, you have to meet the highest environmental standards and you'll receive financial help for that. The NAFTA worked to the disadvantage of Mexico, to the disadvantage of those communities that needed the help the most. And I've always thought the EU was of trade deals, and sure it can be improved, but something of a model. So I'd be fascinated to know if you think I've been too rosy-colored glasses about the way the EU has worked.
Well, Tano, I think you kind of referenced this before. I have a feeling you would not think that would be a great model for multilateral trade deals to serve?
Not just me, but people in Portugal, people in Greece, people, they will all think, and half the people who voted Brexit do not think it's a great model. The thing is this, I mean, there are obvious difficulties in the discussion we're having. On the one hand, there's the fear that you let go of this and its potential for reformability, I don't know whether that's realistic or not, you let in the Trumps of the world and Le Pen and so on and so forth. But the fact does remain that we ought to aim higher. You know, there's a sense in which people are saying, I'm hearing on the one side that you ought to be practical and do what is achievable. Well, what is practical and achievable is in the context of the free traders. It's in the context of those who dominate the European market and so on and so forth. So the view that there ought to be an alternative, I think, is a fundamentally important one. And that alternative has to be able to inform, even if tactically we are going for a short-term fix to a problem which ameliorates rather than totally transforms. Nonetheless, it is that idea that we ought, a real root and branch alternative that ought to drive us forward. The EU as is not one of those alternatives. It's not an alternative for its own citizens, let alone for the poorer peoples of the world. It's not. Okay, so I don't know enough of the intricacies of the structures and the institutions and so on to be able to say its architecture is a model or not. What I know is that in Africa, for example, it is the EU architecture that parts of it have been imported into the emerging sub-regional and regional agreements. And their effect so far has been to marginalize and delimit democracy a lot more, because here you are enshrined in a supranational constitutional institutional framework, rights and obligations which citizens at the local level are in no position to roll back on, to confront, to challenge, and so on. So again, I'm also curious to hear a lot more about the possibility of this, progressive, the suddenly because the EU as it is a leading neoliberal center, and how it won't become that. I'm very intrigued to find out.
Reinhard, defend the EU model.
I think I just heard a very fervent Brexit argument. But if you allude to people in Greece or people in Portugal who have justified claims to criticize present policies in the EU and in their own countries, by the way, you still should take note of the fact that they by no means want to leave the EU. So even though they criticize it, they have a trust in the model, and the trust in this model has grown over the last half year. In all the countries of which we have polling, the trust has risen as an effect of the Brexit referendum in the UK, because people are realizing that with all deficiencies, this model has a lot of advantages that you don't find elsewhere. And I mean, maybe this is a philosophical point, I still want to make it. Where does the new future grow? It grows among the old bad traditions. You don't write news stories on empty pages. You don't write history on empty pages. You write history on palimpsest. And you have to develop the new, the better from among what is not good. And to just idealize the concept that somehow something completely different should grow up from the ashes, that's never happened. Only after, possibly after a complete catastrophe, I wouldn't want to pay that price. So I think what differentiates the EU, I would not describe the EU as a free trade model, but leave that aside. What differentiates the EU from some of the trade relations we've been discussing is, and I completely agree with Elizabeth, it has a democratic decision-making process. And we can't have that with NAFTA, we can't have that with TTIP or with anything else, because the US Congress would never agree to obeying laws being passed by a superior authority. So that's not going to happen. And this is giving us as consumers, us as workers, us as advocates of environmental concerns, a voice that we would not have unless we had those democratic options. And regarding the second question about what the subnational level can do, that depends on the internal political division of responsibility in individual member states. So there are 3 member states in particular where the regions have a major role, which is Belgium, Austria, and Germany. And in either of these 3 countries, if there would be majorities, the regions could stop the ratification of CETA.
So they can actually exercise some significant power. Very interesting discussion. I'm sure it will continue on over the next day and a half. But a round of applause for our excellent panelists. And thank you all very much for joining us today.
I just wanted to add one thing. No relation. Thank you. Thank you.